what does it mean to understand something? If you looked up in the dictionary, you get that definition that it means to grasp something, to take it in, to believe it. But I found something interesting where it says, it comes from an old word that it makes sense when you think about it. It means to stand under. Understand is to stand under. And I've been thinking about that definition as I've been thinking about the question that we're going to talk about today, the question that Jesus asked his disciples in John chapter 13. We've been doing a sermon series on questions that Jesus asked. And we've been talking from week to week that when Jesus asked questions, he already knew the answer. And the reason why he was asking questions was because that question was tailor-made to the person he was talking to, because it was something that if they deeply considered the question and answered it honestly, it might cause a breakthrough in their lives. And I've been wondering ever since, I saw this picture years ago of Mel Gibson on the set of The Passion of the Christ talking to Jim Caviezel, who plays the Christ character in the film. And it's this odd picture, right? You see this crucified Jesus who's talking to Mel Gibson. And on one hand, it's kind of a weird picture because it's on the set of a movie like that. But it made me wonder, what if I was sitting in that chair and Jesus really somehow appeared to me and asked me a question? I wonder what question, if it was tailor-made to me, if Jesus already knew the answer, but if I thought about it deeply and if I answered it honestly, I wonder what question that Jesus would ask me that would cause a breakthrough in my life. Now, what about you? What about you if Jesus appeared to you and he said one thing, and the one thing he was just to ask a question? With what you're going through right now, with the things that maybe you're struggling with, the anxieties you have, the things that you wrestle with, you know better than I do. You would know if Jesus tailor-made a question that if you thought about it deeply, if you answered it honestly, it could cause a breakthrough in your life. What question do you think he would ask you? Yeah, I think we're kind of under a spell in our culture, in the sense that we're so busy with stuff coming at us, whether it's our smartphone or whether it's Netflix or whether it's whatever it is, we don't ever have to be bored. In some sense, we're dying of boredom, but we don't think we are. We're always moving on. There's a sense of a psychological addiction to the next thing. We're always moving on to the next thing, and we never have time like they did 100 years ago and for thousands of years before that, where we just have to sit and think and contemplate. It's almost like we're under a spell where we never can get a moment to breathe and wonder, I wonder what Jesus would say to me right now if he would speak to me. I've been thinking a lot about the question that we're going to talk about today, and I honestly think that if Jesus appeared to me and he was going to ask one question that was tailor-made to me, that if I thought about it deeply and answered it honestly, it would cause a breakthrough in my life. It's the question we're going to look at today. And I think that might be true in some sense for all of us. Let's just get right into it. In John chapter 13, verse 1, it says this, and this is the Apostle John writing. He says, it was just before the Passover festival. So if we've been reading, we know the Passover festival, we're getting very close to Jesus being crucified. He's going to be crucified the next day. And the Passover was this time where they would sacrifice a Passover lamb. God's wrath would pass over them. It goes all the way back to Exodus chapter 12. And for hundreds of years, they've been sacrificing this Passover lamb every year. But we now know that it's ultimately been pointing to Jesus as the sacrifice, Jesus as the Passover lamb that would cause the wrath of God to pass over. And so he says this, he says, Jesus knew that the hour had come. He knew the hour had come for him to leave. Listen to the language, it's so weird and transcendent for Jesus to leave this world and go to the Father. Now we just got to stop right there and realize that if we've been reading the Gospel of John, we already have read the first chapter that Jesus was with God in the beginning and he was God, and through him everything was made. We would have already read Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life. We would have already read that everything that had been created by Jesus. And we would already have read that Jesus saw himself, actually we'd read in a few more chapters, that Jesus saw himself as having always existed with the Father in this plurality of relationship. We call it the Trinity. The Bible never uses the word Trinity, but the Bible is always giving us this picture of God revealing himself to us as a Father, and also another person in the Trinity as the Son, another one as the Holy Spirit. The three we call the Trinity. We don't quite understand it, but somehow God became human in the person of Jesus, the second person of the Trinity. He's fully human, but he's fully God. He had been given a mission. He had lived his life to teach, to do miracles, and now the hour has come for him to leave this world to which he came and return to the Father. And then the next verse, the next part of that verse says this: having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. But not everybody's his own. Not everybody his own that he loved to the end. And so we read a very uncomfortable next verse, verse 2. The evening meal was in progress. This is the Passover meal. And the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Now, I could preach an entire sermon on that one verse. We don't have time to look at it today. We don't know anything about what hardly any of that means, except to say the only thing I can imagine to say is that somehow, I don't know how, and we don't even have a category for this because the main character in that verse, the devil, we don't even have a category for that in our modern world, but somehow Judas had become under a kind of spell. That's the best way to understand it. To where he saw Jesus differently than he had perhaps before. He saw himself in a different story than perhaps he had before. And it got to the point, even though he was one of Jesus' closest disciples in the sense of he was one of the 12, he had now come to the point where everything was sort of discombobulated in the narrative he thought he was in, that he was getting ready to betray Jesus. That somehow the devil had prompted him, had put in his heart, put him under a spell in some kind of sense, where he saw himself in a different kind of narrative. And so verse 3 says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So, now this doesn't make sense to us, but to John it makes perfect sense. Knowing all those things, so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. Now that seems very, very strange to us. But in those days, they lived in a culture where they wore sandals, their feet were exposed. It's a dry, arid, dusty, dirty environment. When they had meals, now when we have a meal, we sit at a table and we put our feet kind of under the table, hidden from everybody. In those days, they would recline at the table. They would recline, lay down kind of toward the table, a short table if they had a table. It might just be a blanket kind of thing. And their feet are kind of part of the whole mix. They're all kind of feeted up against each other. And so the stench, the dirt, the smell of the feet is all part of the meal environment. And so, if you really wanted to have a nice meal and not be grossed out by one another, you're going to wash your feet before the meal. But who would wash the feet? Well, the average person, probably in the average household, there was a way to wash your own feet, not perfectly, but enough for all of us to recline and have a meal together without being grossed out. But in uppity kind of places, in an uppity kind of meal, in a nice room like this is the Passover meal, this is kind of the Christmas dinner, this is kind of the Thanksgiving feast, this is the Passover meal in a nice place. And so there's going to be more formality. Their feet haven't been washed yet. I don't know who they were expecting to wash the feet, but somehow Jesus gets up and he washes their feet. And it's awkward. I remember years ago, like a year and a half ago, I went to Phoenix with a bunch of guys in my Bible study for kind of a golf trip, time to spend time together. And there was one night we went to a nice restaurant. It was going to be a nice big steak dinner. This is going to be the night we splurged. So we go to a nice restaurant, steak dinner. If you know me, I have the world's smallest bladder. They've actually done a study. A cockroach's bladder is bigger than mine. But I had to get up and use the restroom. And I go into this restroom, and I walk in. It's a very nice restroom. And there's kind of a restroom butler. A man in a suit is standing right there, and as he comes in, he welcomes me into the restroom, and he points to where I might use one of the facilities. I'm like, okay. He's standing right there. I finish. I turn around. He goes, "Do you feel better now? Do you feel better now, sir?" I'm like, "Yeah, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, sure." I go wash my hands. He's right there as I wash my hands. He's getting a towel. He has a towel ready. I wash my hands. I like this, and he's like, "Here, sir." He hands me a towel. The bathroom butler is a very awkward moment for me. And if you know me, I kind of want to make sure people get tipped. I kind of want to make sure that I don't come across as a cheapskate. So I pull out a few bucks, probably more than the average person, just because I feel the guy's working at least. And so I want to pay him. I give him a tip. I walk back to the table. I'm like, they got a bathroom butler or something in there. And then about 20 minutes later, because we're, drinking water and wine and having a steak, I got to go again. So I go back, I open the door, and again, it's just me and the bathroom butler. Hello again, sir. We go through the same exact routine. I do the same tip. I walk out. This is going to be an expensive night. It's awkward, not just expensive. Now imagine Jesus. Peter had been spending 3 years with Jesus. He'd seen Jesus calm the storm, walk on water, raise the dead, heal the blind, teach the way he's teaching. Peter was the one who said, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And now at this meal with their stinky, dirty feet still having to be dealt with, it's Jesus that gets up and he takes water and he bends down and he's going to wash their feet. And the awkwardness overtakes Peter. So we read in the next verse, verse 6, he came to Simon Peter who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing. I mean, yes, I'm washing your feet, but you don't realize what I'm really doing, but later you will understand." So obviously we're seeing that just like lots of places in the Bible where Jesus is talking on kind of a literal level, but he's really talking about a transcendent meaning like living water, bread from heaven, all that kind of stuff. Jesus is doing that here. You don't understand what I'm doing, but later, after a lot has happened, you will. "No," said Peter. "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, "Not just my feet, but my hands, my head as well." Everything. He's just wanting to dive in. Jesus answered, "Those who have it," and this is strange, we're not going to have time to talk about this, "those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." John says, "For he knew who was going to betray him." He's thinking of Judas. Back to that. "And that was why he said, not every one of you was clean." Clearly, Jesus is washing their feet because this has some transcendent symbolic meaning. He had loved his very own from the beginning to the end, and so he got up to wash their feet. There's an incredible meaning here. "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me," except not for Judas. Now, he's washing Judas' feet. He knows Judas is going to betray him. So that's an amazing thing in and of itself. But what I'm doing here doesn't apply to all of you. One of you is going to betray me. The guy who fell into the wrong narrative. The guy who fell under a spell and saw Jesus differently, saw his life differently, pursued a different path. Not him. So verse 12, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. And it says, "Do you understand what I have just done for you?" Now the question was to be remembered more than answered right there, because he's saying to them, they're not going to understand what he's doing. It's a question to be remembered because, see, this is, again, the night before Jesus is going to be crucified. They don't know what's ahead. They're stuck in that moment in time. They don't have, like we have, the benefit of hindsight, so they don't know what's going to happen. So somehow Jesus has to help them understand the meaning of the chaos and the misery that's getting ready to take place. And so he gets up and washes their feet. It's a metaphor. It's a picture that they'll remember. It's a picture worth 1,000 words that they'll remember of all that's about to take place. And in this picture, like when you look at almost any picture that you're in, you want to find yourself, you're in this picture. In this picture, you're the dirty feet. I'm the dirty feet. That's who we are in this picture. Dirt, stench, uncleanness that ruins our lives, that ruins our relationships. That's the metaphor the Bible often uses to talk about sin. It's the things that we hate about ourselves, that we know we're our own worst enemy. It's the things that frustrate us so much about ourselves, and yet sin at the same time is something we love more than almost anything else. We instinctively know that makes us dirty. We instinctively know that gives us guilt. It doesn't matter what you believe. We instinctively know that. That's why we work so hard to constantly hide our dirt, our filth, our guilt from everyone else. Rebecca McLaughlin wrote a book recently called Confronting Christianity. By the way, it's an excellent book. I liked it so much, I contacted her and asked her to come speak here. She's going to come speak here on Sunday, October 27th in our worship service. Something out of her book. It doesn't matter. She can speak in anything. It's all great. But she's going to come here. But she points this out in her book, that we know regardless of what you believe about God. Right? You may not even believe there's a God. You may not even believe in judgment. You may not believe in good, evil. You may not believe in heaven, hell. Regardless of what you believe, we all know we have this guilt. We all know that we have this dirt that we have to hide. Here's how you know. It's been said that no relationship in the world would last a day if we could see all of each other's thoughts. Can you imagine that? If you could see all of each other's thoughts, all of them, would your marriage last? Would your relationship with your kids? How'd that go? Work? Friendships? Church? Imagine if you could hear, if you could see all of our thoughts. And here's what she says. She says, here's how you know. Run this test on yourself today and tomorrow. She goes, think of every relationship that you value and ask this. Would I let them see a video or read a transcript of all of my thoughts and actions in the last week? Would I test any relationship like that? Would the relationship survive it? Probably not. That's why we all manage our self-disclosure. Because our relationships hinge on the reality that we have to hide ourselves. They won't survive us not hiding ourselves in significant ways from other people seeing our guilt, from other people seeing our dirt. You may not even believe in guilt, and yet you know you have guilt, and that's why you hide it. We all do. We all do it. On the other hand, Jesus constantly talks about God seeing all of our dirt, seeing all of our thoughts, seeing all of our actions. Nothing we can do is hidden from His sight. Everything we do is laid bare before Him. And the question is, can His relationship with us survive it? We can't manage our self-disclosure with God. And so we instinctively try to hide from God. We, in a way that we just sort of try to ignore Him. We try to turn the volume down on conviction in our lives. We try to stay away. We don't feel like we can come to Him in prayer when we feel dirty, when we feel guilty. That's why the key to understanding Jesus washing the disciples' feet and the key to understanding His question, do you understand all that I've done for you, the key is not so much to see that as an example that we are to do for others. I mean, it is that. We should preach sermons on that. It certainly is that. But that is not the key thing we are to understand about this. The key is, have you ever seen Jesus wash your feet? Is that how you think of when you think of Jesus washing your feet? We can see it in verse 8. It's a kind of universal declaration. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Now, in fact, here, the word part, where he says, you have no part with me, in the ancient Greek language, this was written in ancient Greek. In the ancient Greek language, that word usually means inheritance. And we saw that word in our worship time where it's talking about the inheritance we have of the kingdom of God. It's that theme all throughout Jesus' teaching, that He came to bring the kingdom of God, that we would inherit the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven coming back to earth, this new restored earth without evil, without sin. And therefore that means without you or with a new you. but not with the same you. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, this is church. You're here on a Sunday morning. You can be doing lots of other things. If I had to bet, I would say most of you, not all of you, because some of you are guests from a friend or family members. We're really glad you're here. But I would say most of you probably, if you had to bet whether or not it's true, that the witness of the apostles is true, that Jesus rose from the dead, you're not going to have 100% proof. You're not going to have 100% faith. But if you had to put your bet down, if you had to put your nickel down, true or not true, my guess is most of you would say, okay, if I have to bet, I'd say true. And we all know this sort of, it's become a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's a repeated truth that we might believe something to be true. We might believe that it happened. We might even read our Bibles and be convicted by it sometimes, that it's true that Jesus died on the cross, that he rose from the dead, and yet somehow we haven't really understood it. Jesus says, have you really understood all that I've done for you, what Jesus' death and resurrection means for you? The whole narrative that the God who created this universe became human in the person of Jesus. He taught in such a way that people were amazed by the authority with which he taught. He did miracles in such a way where he had thousands of people following him. He eventually suffered and died on the cross, and he rose from the dead. That whole narrative that you say, most of you would put your nickel down, that's true. He did all that in order to give us the kingdom, not to give God the kingdom. God already has the kingdom, but he did all that to earn back the kingdom that we lost in the beginning, to give us the kingdom. That's the point of what his miracles are pointing to. That's the point. And we have no idea. But this whole narrative, if this is true, if Jesus died, if Jesus rose from the dead, then what that means is that is the story your life is in. Here's what it also means. That if you see the main story of your life as anything else, you're under a spell. You're living in a fiction. Something's been happened where even though you believe this is true, you can't see how this, therefore, is the story that your life is in. You're preoccupied with another story. Isn't that weird? We all do it. It's almost like we all, to some degree, are under a spell. But this means that Jesus' storyline is the only real storyline your life is in. It means that even though this is the story that our life is in, we've developed this fiction, and in this fiction, we always have to be hiding. But in this story, we don't have to hide. Because Jesus says, do you understand? Do you understand what I have done for you? And we go back to that picture, and now we see a graphic image of what he's done for us. And the question is, do we believe it? Do we grasp it? Do we take it in? Do we stand under the reality of what Jesus has done for us by dying on the cross, what God has done for us by becoming human, coming to this world, being willingly betrayed, and then dying and suffering on the cross and rising from the dead? And he did so as a human forever, and he'll return as a human forever. He's fully God, but fully human. He is fully invested. Do you understand, or should we say, do you stand under Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus' resurrection, and everything that it means for you? So what does it mean to stand under? What does it mean to understand what Jesus has done for us? Well, I think it's kind of the whole story. I think it's the whole thing. That God is doing something really big in this world. And God offers to do something really big in your life because he's already done it. There's that phrase that comes up in verse 1. Let's look at it again. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Having loved, he loved. He loved them to the end. The end implies a narrative. The end implies we're inside of a story. And so the Apostle Paul, when he reflects on the death of Jesus, Paul never knew Jesus until he saw Jesus rise from the dead. But he reflects on the crucifixion of Jesus, and he says, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul didn't see it as Jesus somehow dying for humanity in general. He saw Jesus' crucifixion as being very personal, that God became human to die on the cross for him. And I wonder if we see that story as our story, like the Apostle Paul, who loved me, he says of Jesus, and gave himself for me. Jesus says here, John says here of Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end, and so he washes them. Psalm 139 tells us in a poetic way that God created us, knit us together in our mother's womb, was intimately acquainted with us in our womb, has ordained for us the number of our days before one of them came to be. And I've said this before, I'm going to say it again because I can't quite get it out of my mind. Then it's hard to believe, but God wanted me, God wanted you to exist in his universe. It's almost impossible to believe because we know that we're guilty. We know that we have dirt, but that Jesus came to die for you, that God created you because he wanted you to exist forever. Part of this story, this whole narrative, he wanted you to exist in his universe. It's almost impossible to believe. But Jesus says, when he's down there washing the disciples' feet in this story, their dirty feet, and he says, you don't understand now what I'm doing, but one day you will. He washes their feet, and it's as if he looks up from the pages of this text, and he looks you and me right in the eye, and he says, do you get it? Do you understand all that I've done for you? Follow me. Trust me. Be my disciple, because I am the only story that has the ending that will bring you the kingdom. Now maybe it's time for you to wake up from your spell. Maybe it's time for you to stop living this fictitious life that somehow you think is real when the real story is proven by the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's the real story your life is in. Because once you understand, once you stand under what Jesus, what the God of the universe, once you stand under what he has done for you, then you will want to stand under his lordship, his kingship. You'll realize that his will is the narrative of having loved you as his own. He will love you to the end. And there's no other narrative. Every other narrative you have to hide. Not with him. No matter what it may cost you, and it may cost you the world, Jesus says, no matter what it may cost you, Jesus is worth it. Because of who Jesus is and because of what Jesus has done, whatever it costs you, Jesus is worth it. Again, Rebecca McLaughlin, I think, has a great illustration of this in her book. And she's writing toward the end, and she's talking about a Russian novel, Eugene Onegin. It was written back in the early 1800s. It's written about a guy who's 25 years old in Russia. He's come into some wealth. He's an aristocrat. He has an aristocratic wealth, and he goes to visit his brother in the countryside. His brother has a fiancée in the countryside. The fiancée has a sister in the countryside. This Onegin is 25. She's 17. The girl falls in love with him. She offers him. She says, I want you to marry. I want to marry you. She offers him his love for the rest of his life. Then he doesn't reply. He ignores her. She finally sees him again, and she says, I'm offering you my love. And he says, that's very touching. I really appreciate it. But I'm just not the kind of guy that wants to get bogged down with marriage. I can't make a commitment like this. I have too many other plans with my life. And he just kind of says, he just moves on. He's kind of a cynical, jaded guy, and so he doesn't really have a lot of belief and commitment and love and those kinds of things. He believes more in his own story that he wants to live. Years go by, and he sees her at a party in St. Petersburg, Russia. Again, this is in the early 1800s. This is a story, not a true story. Sees her at a party, and he's stunned by how beautiful she has become, magnificently beautiful, and he falls in love with her, becomes obsessed with her. The problem is, so many years have gone by, she's moved on. She's married to somebody else. And he catches her and he sees her and he says, would you leave your husband and elope with me? You said you love me. Let's go together. And she says, I did love you. I had the door open to you, but now it's shut. I have other commitments. I married somebody else. And Rebecca McLaughlin points out that, as tragic of a love story that is, it's kind of cliche because there's something about it that's almost written in the fabric of the universe. It's almost like every story that people can see their life in. Either you see the beauty of somebody now or you'll see it later and regret it. Like Tatiana, the 17-year-old girl, Jesus comes to us now and he writes us a letter, so to speak, that we read in the epistles, that we read in the Gospels, and he says, do you understand what I've done for you? I love you. I want to give myself to you, and I want to give the kingdom to you. Will you come with me? Will you follow me? Will you commit to me? I've died for you. I've risen for you. You can have all of this if you just come and be my disciple. And we're like Anna Jen, who says, well, that's touching. I appreciate it. I love it when somebody loves me. Thanks for dying. But, I'm just kind of cynical. I'm kind of jaded. I have other plans. I'm not a guy that makes good commitments. I just kind of have other things I want to do with my money, with my time. And we sort of not disbelieve or even touched by it, but we just sort of apathetic, just sort of cynical. It doesn't really matter so much because other things matter instead. And the Bible teaches that one day Jesus will return. That's the whole point of him dying. That's the whole point of him rising. He promises one day he's going to return and he's going to bring his kingdom that's going to restore the earth, that's going to bring a resurrection for you, a glorious body without sin, without stain, if you're one of his own. And there'll come a time for some, they'll see him and they will marvel at his beauty and they will marvel at his glory and they will want in, but they didn't want in when the door was open. Now it's shut. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to help you see the narrative that your life is really in, because I hope that you will wake up from your spell. Because the story you're in right now is just cynical. It's jaded. It doesn't have an end. This is the only story that has an end. Your story you have to hide. And the love is not real because it's not really you. It's a self-disclosed you that's very carefully disclosed. This is the only real. Wake up. You're under a spell. As the worship team comes back up, let's just think for a moment, just stop for a moment and think inside our minds, what if Jesus right now appeared to you? Nail scars in his hands, resurrected body, and he appeared to you and he says, do you understand? Will you stand under? Do you understand all that I've done for you and therefore will do for you? If you just be my disciple, if you just come now, if you just trust now, when it's not too late. Because whatever it costs you to be his disciple, Jesus is worth it. Amen.